The glass was already raised when my father said it. 22 people at the table, the good plates out, the ham still steaming, and my father standing at the head of it all like a man who'd been waiting his whole life for this exact moment. He tapped his knife against the rim, and the room went quiet the way rooms do when the person holding the floor has never once in his life been told to sit down. I was at the kids' table. 34 years old, a folding chair, a bowl of crayons beside my plate. My sister-in-law Melissa had arranged the seating with the precision of someone who wanted a specific person in a specific place before a specific thing happened. I'd let it go. I'm good at letting things go. That was about to change. My father, Gerald Hayes, raised his glass and gave the speech he'd been writing in his head for 40 years. He talked about blood and soil. He talked about the boy who'd stayed to work the ground. He talked about legacy the way men talk about it when they've confused their own pride with something sacred. And then, because the speech wasn't complete without it, he turned to me. Some of my children chose this family, he said. And some of them drove away from it. You stopped being a Hayes the day you left this land. There's nothing here for you. My mother's face went white. Forks went still. Down at the foot of the table, my grandmother, Edith Hayes, 82 years old, folded both hands over the cracked leather purse in her lap. And in the silence after my father's words, I watched her thumb move slowly across the worn brass clasp. Not opening it. Not yet. Just resting there. Waiting. What my father didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 3 weeks earlier, I had sat at my desk at the county recorder's office and read something that made his entire speech a fiction. And my grandmother had been carrying the proof of it in that purse for 25 years. I need to back up, because none of what happened at that Easter table makes sense until you understand what I do for a living and what I found when I finally thought to look. I'm a title examiner. I work at the county recorder's office 20 minutes up the road. It's not a glamorous job. I read deeds. I trace chains of title. I find the place where someone's grandfather signed something in 1962 and follow it forward owner by owner until I know exactly who holds a piece of land and how. People think I push paper. What I actually do is settle arguments before anyone throws a punch, because the paper already knows who's right. To my family, I was simply the one who left. I'd grown up on the Hayes farm. 140 acres of corn and soybeans my great-grandfather broke by hand. I left at 18 for night classes and a paralegal certificate I paid for myself. To my father, that was a betrayal of the dirt. To me, it was just a different kind of work. But I never actually left the people. I was the one who drove Grandma Edith to her cardiology appointments. I fixed her washing machine, refilled her pill organizer, sat with her on the porch when the evening came down soft over the fields. I was useful. I thought being useful was the same as being safe. I was about to learn it wasn't. The farm had a rhythm that ran the whole family like a clock. My father treated that ground like scripture. My brother Dean had stayed, married Melissa, raised 2 kids in the rooms above the kitchen where Grandma Edith still lived. My parents in the addition out back. The whole family under one roof and me in town. That geography had become a verdict. They were the ones who stayed. I was the one who drove away. And for years, I'd accepted the sentence without reading the charge. The first crack appeared 2 weeks before Easter, when I came by to drop off Grandma's prescriptions and heard Dean in the mudroom, his voice low and careful. He didn't know I was there. Once Grandma signs, he was saying we're fine. I set the bag on the counter quietly and left. But I took the word with me. Fine in my family was usually said by someone who wasn't. That same week, an ordinary supper turned into the first announcement. My father set down his fork mid-meal and said it like a verdict. This farm goes to the one who stayed. Travis didn't look up. Melissa did. She looked straight at me and smiled the smile of someone holding cards she thinks are better than yours. Then I came in the back door 2 days later and found Dean at the kitchen table with papers spread in front of Grandma Edith. Refinance papers. I knew the look of them the way a nurse knows a chart. He was leaning over her, voice soft in the way that isn't soft at all. It's just to get us through the season, he said. The bank needs it before the planting loan comes due. You just sign here. Grandma Edith had both hands flat over her purse in her lap. She didn't pick up the pen. Some papers you sign once and can't unsign, she said. I learned that a long time ago. Dean straightened up fast when he saw me in the doorway. He gathered the papers like a man covering a hand of cards. Family business, he said. I left without arguing. But that evening on the porch, Grandma took my wrist with one cold hand and held it a moment longer than a goodbye. She didn't explain. She just looked out at the barn, the white letters going gray in the early dark, and she said it again, soft almost to herself. Can't unsign. I drove home that night with the feeling I couldn't file. My brother needed her signature badly. My grandmother, who never said anything by accident, was warning me without telling me why. And somewhere beneath all of it, a question had started growing that I couldn't ignore. If the farm was my father's, why did anyone need an 82-year-old woman to sign a refinance? You can't borrow against land you don't own. The Monday before Easter, before the office opened to the public, I sat down at my desk and pulled up the Grantor Grantee Index for our township. I typed in a name I'd known my whole life. Hayes. I traced the chain backward year by year, the way I'd done for 1,000 strangers' properties. And somewhere around 25 years ago, the chain did something I did not expect. It bent. The deed was dated the year I turned 9. I remember being 9, the summer the creek dried up and we lost half the corn. What I did not know, what I had never known, was that in that same year the entire farm had been deeded out of my grandfather's name and into something called the Edith Hayes Living Trust. Not to my father. Not to the estate. To a trust with my grandmother as the sole trustee. I read it 3 times. The 140 acres. The house. The barn with the white letters. All of it had belonged for 25 years to my grandmother. My father had been farming land he did not own. He had been calling it his at every supper, deciding who would inherit it, planning to hand it to Dean like a man passing down a watch that was never in his pocket to begin with. And the whole time the recorder's office, 2 doors from my desk, had quietly known the truth. I leaned back in my chair. The question that came next landed cold. Did my father know? I couldn't answer that from a screen. But somebody called him before I got home from the office that day, because he rang me that evening already loud. I hear you've been down at the courthouse snooping in my business. I told him it was public record, that anyone could look. That was the wrong thing to say to a man whose whole identity was built on the idea that the land obeyed him. This farm goes to the one who stayed, he said, biting down on each word. Not the one who snoops. Dad, I said, quiet. Have you ever actually seen the deed? The silence on the line told me everything. He hadn't. He'd never needed to because no one had ever made him. Don't you dare ruin Easter, he said, and hung up. I set the phone down. He believed it so completely that I understood the real question wasn't whether he knew. It was who had let him not know, and why. The why came from money, and money keeps better records than people do. A friend near a local lender mentioned the way people mention things over coffee, that the Hayes operation had a balloon payment coming due. A large one. The kind where you make small payments for years and then one day the whole remaining debt lands at once, and if you can't cover it, the bank takes what's behind it. Dean's came due the first week after Easter. To make it, he needed to refinance against the land. And to refinance, he needed the one signature that could pledge it. His grandmother's as trustee. She'd already told him no with a pen she wouldn't pick up. So he needed her cornered. Surrounded. In a room full of people she loved. On a day when saying no would cost her the warmth of the whole family around her. Then it clicked the way a survey line clicks into place and the whole map makes sense at once. Easter wasn't a dinner. It was a deadline. My father would stand up in front of 22 people and announce the farm was going to Dean. The whole family would beam. And in that warm public glow with everyone watching, Dean would slide the refinance papers in front of Grandma Edith. and ask her to make the announcement official. Who says no to that? In front of the family on Easter with grandchildren at the table? They hadn't planned a celebration. They had built a room she couldn't say no in. And my father had set the date himself, never once knowing he was the centerpiece of a plan he hadn't been told about. I went to the kitchen, printed a clean copy of the recorded deed and the trust memorandum, and folded it into my bag. 2 days before Easter, I drove Grandma Edith to her cardiology appointment, the way I had for years. We were parked outside the clinic early, the heater ticking, and she did something she had never done in front of me. She opened the purse. She didn't take anything out. She just held it open so I could see inside. The way you'd show someone a bird's nest without touching it. Tucked against the lining was a long envelope, gone yellow and soft at the folds, the kind of yellow that only comes from being carried for decades, not stored. On the front, in her own slanted handwriting, were the words, "Edith's instructions. Open when Gerald forgets whose it is." Below the writing, faint but unmistakable to a woman who stamps documents for a living, was the inked rectangle of a county recorder's mark. I knew that stamp. I'd pressed it 1,000 times. Whatever was in that envelope had been recorded the same week as the deed I'd found on my screen. They were the same truth. One on a county server, one in an old woman's purse. "I've carried this for 25 years, she said, and snapped the clasp shut. "I'll know the day to open it." I asked her carefully if my father knew what was inside. She looked at the clinic doors for a long moment. "Your father forgot whose it is a long time ago," she said. "I let him. That was my mistake to make." She patted my knee and we went in. And I drove home knowing the courthouse and the purse held the same secret, and that only one of them could speak out loud at a table full of people. What I didn't know yet was that my grandmother had already chosen her moment. She'd been choosing it for 25 years. And my father had just scheduled it, catered it, and sent out invitations to 22 witnesses. She didn't need rescuing. She needed an audience. And they'd built her one. Easter morning, the farmhouse smelled the way it always had. Lemon oil and ham and coffee, and something underneath all of it that I'd never been able to name until that morning standing in the doorway. What I was smelling was ownership. Quiet, patient, 25 years of a woman rubbing polish into wood that had always been hers. The big dining table had come from my great-grandfather. He'd built it from oak he'd cut on the place, the same year he painted the barn. My grandmother had worked lemon oil into that grain for every holiday of her life. Standing there watching her cross the room to her chair, I understood for the first time that she hadn't been maintaining someone else's table. She'd been tending her own. In the front hall, the tall grandfather clock ticked 4 minutes fast, the way it always had. Right on schedule, Grandma Edith crossed to it, opened the case and wound it with the brass key. Slow. Deliberate. The way you win something you intend to keep running. 22 places were set. The good plates with the gold rims. And on the sideboard near the window, half tucked under a folded napkin where he thought no one would notice, sat a manila folder face down. Dean's refinance papers staged and waiting for the warm part of the afternoon. I caught Grandma Edith's eye across the room. She gave me nothing. Just the smallest nod. The kind a woman gives when she has already decided how something ends and is simply waiting for the others to catch up. Before the meal, my father pulled me onto the porch and shut the door behind him. Gerald Hayes never lowered his voice unless he was about to do something he didn't want witnessed. He stood with his back to the barn, the white letters going gray behind his shoulders. He told me he knew what I'd been doing. The questions. The courthouse. His voice was flat and certain, the voice of a man who had never once been wrong on his own land. "You came here to ruin this for your brother," he said. I told him I hadn't. He looked at me then with something worse than anger. The look of a man who has already written you out, and is just waiting for you to accept it. "You stopped being a Hayes the day you left," he said. Quiet and final like a gate swinging shut. I had read a lot of hard documents in my life. Foreclosures. evictions. The cold arithmetic of families losing everything they thought was theirs. None of them had ever landed in me the way those words did, because none of them had come from my father's mouth on the porch where I learned to walk. I felt the whole thing rise in me, the urge to say it right there. The deed isn't yours. You've been wrong for 25 years. But I'd spent my career learning that the loudest you can ever be is to say nothing and let the record speak. So I gave him the only line I had. Funny, I said. The deed never got that memo. He didn't understand it. I watched it slide right past him. He thought he'd silenced me. He'd actually just told me exactly when to speak. I went back inside through the kitchen and stopped in the hallway, because Dean and Melissa were in the pantry, voices low. Dean was talking himself calm. After the toast, he was saying, "While she's emotional, I bring out the papers. She won't say no in front of everybody. Dad has no idea it's even a question. Far as he knows, it's already ours. Far as he knows." There it was. My father didn't know. He genuinely believed the farm was his to give. He'd believed it for 40 years. And Dean had been using that belief, running my father out front like a man who doesn't know he's carrying someone else's flag. It should have made me hate Dean more. And part of me did. But it also shifted something. My father wasn't the architect of the lie. He was its longest-serving prisoner. That didn't erase the porch. A man can be a victim of a deception and still choose cruelty with the breath it gives him. But it told me how the afternoon had to go. I couldn't simply expose my father. If I got this wrong, I'd humiliate a man who'd been kept in the dark for a quarter century, and the room would close around him, and I'd become exactly the villain Melissa had already been telling people I was all week. The truth had to come from the one person who had earned the right to tell it. From the woman who had written the envelope. All I had to do was make sure she got the floor. She found me by the window while the others were finding their seats. She didn't waste words. She never did. "Did you read it?" she asked. "The county copy." I told her I had the deed, the trust memorandum, all of it, folded in my bag. She nodded once, the way she nodded when she was checking that the second witness had arrived before the signing. "Good," she said. "Then you'll know I'm not making it up when I open this." She put her cold hand over mine on the windowsill. And she said the thing I will carry the rest of my life. "You never wanted the land, Nora," she said. "You just kept showing up for the people standing on it. That's the only deed that ever mattered to me." I didn't trust my voice, so I just held her hand. Across the room, my father was waving people into chairs, expansive, the host of his own coronation. Dean hovered near the sideboard. Melissa steered the children. 22 people lowering into 22 chairs around a table that smelled of lemon oil and belonged, every inch of it, to the small woman standing beside me. The clock in the hall ticked 4 minutes ahead of the world. We were almost there. The meal went the way those meals go. Ham and prayer and too much talking. And then my father stood. He tapped his glass with his knife, that bright little ring that pulls a room to silence. 22 faces turned toward him. He had the look he'd worn my whole life, the look of a man about to hand down the law. My mother folded her napkin in her lap, smaller and smaller. Dean shifted toward the sideboard. And down at the foot of the table, in the chair closest to the window, my grandmother reached beside her, lifted the cracked leather purse, and set it on the lemon-polished oak in front of her, both hands resting on the brass clasp. My father lifted his glass. My grandmother lifted her purse onto the table. Only one of them noticed the other. My father gave the speech. He talked about blood and soil. He talked about the boy who stayed and the land that rewarded loyalty. He was good at it, the way proud men are good when they finally get the floor they've been waiting for. He said the farm, all 140 acres, would go to Dean, who had earned it with his hands. The room made the warm sound of a crowd that agrees. Then he turned to me because he couldn't help himself, because the speech had never been complete without putting me in my place. "Some children choose their family," he said, "and some of them drive away from it. You stopped being a Hayes the day you left this land. There is nothing here for you." My mother's face went the color of the tablecloth. Her hand came up slowly to her mouth. Dean was already moving toward the folder. And Melissa, 2 seats down, caught my eye and mouthed it soft and certain. "You don't get a say." That was the moment my father had built his whole afternoon toward. The land given. The daughter erased. The papers about to come out. He raised his glass to seal it. And into the silence after his cruelty came a sound nobody at that table expected. The small dry click of a worn brass clasp coming open. 22 heads turned toward the foot of the table. I stood up. Not fast, not loud. I rose from the folding chair by the kitchen where they'd seated me, and I laid my printed copy of the county deed on the white tablecloth beside my plate and smoothed it flat with one hand. Every eye that wasn't on my grandmother swung to me. My father's face moved from surprise to fury in about a second. "Sit down, Nora," he said. I didn't. In my job, I've learned that the loudest voice in any room almost always loses to the quietest document. And I had a document. "Dad," I said, and I kept my voice the way I kept it for the angriest people at my counter, even unhurried certain. "Before anyone signs anything this afternoon, let's just read what's already on file." Dean froze with his hand on the folder. Melissa's triumph flickered at the edges. My father opened his mouth to roll right over me, the way he had rolled over me at every table for 34 years. He didn't get the chance. Because at the foot of the table, my grandmother had already drawn out the long yellow envelope, soft at the folds from 25 years of being carried. She laid it on the oak in front of her. She pressed it flat with both hands, the way you press something you have been waiting your whole life to finally put down. And then, in a voice that did not shake at all, she began to speak. "Before my son hands out my house," she said, "the table should know whose house it is." She slid her thumb under the flap and drew out the papers with the same care she gave everything she'd kept. She laid them open on the wood where the window light crossed them. I could see them from where I stood. The original trust document, pages soft as worn cloth. A copy of the deed. The recorder's stamp in faded red ink. And a single handwritten page in her own slanted hand. 25 years ago, she said, I put this farm into my trust. The year Nora turned 9. Your grandfather signed it from his sick bed with 2 witnesses, and we recorded it at the county the same week. She looked down the length of the table at my father, and her voice stayed gentle, which somehow made it worse for him. It was never your land to give, Gerald. It has always been mine. The room didn't breathe. My father's mouth opened and closed without sound. I picked up my printout, walked the full length of that table past every silent face, and laid it down beside her papers so the 2 documents sat side by side on the lemon-polished oak. The same deed, the same stamp, one from her purse and one from the public record. This is the county's copy, I said, quietly enough that everyone had to lean in. Same deed. Same recording date. Anyone at this table can pull it at the courthouse Monday morning. It has been public record for 25 years. None of you ever looked. Aunt Carol leaned forward to read it. The minister reached for his glasses. 2 of the neighbor men exchanged the look of people who already knew they'd be talking about this for years. Melissa broke first, the way the loudest fear always breaks first. She came up out of her chair fast enough that it scraped the floor. Her voice climbed and the children stopped moving and stared. This is ridiculous. She's confused. She's 82. Nora put her up to this. I didn't climb with her. I put one finger on the recorder's stamp, the red ink pressed into the paper before any of us could drive, and I held it there so the table could follow. There's nothing confused about a recording date, I said. This document was filed when I was 9 years old, Melissa. You were in high school. None of us put anyone up to anything that happened before we could drive. Then I said the part one had been waiting 34 years to say, and I said it without any heat at all, which is the only way it lands. You told me I don't get a say because I left. But the only say that has ever been recorded about this farm is hers. And I'm the one who can read it. Melissa sat back down. That was when my father exploded, because the man who has been wrong the longest yells the loudest when the floor finally goes. He came up out of his chair with both hands flat on the table. 40 years, he said. 40 years I worked this ground. I bled on it. It's mine. It has always been mine. I don't care what some paper says. His voice shook the glasses. 22 people watched a proud man come apart at the seams of the story he had told himself his entire life. Through all of it, my grandmother did not flinch. She let him finish. Then she turned over the handwritten page. Her own letter, the one she had sealed inside that envelope a quarter-century ago, and she read it aloud in a voice you had to lean forward to hear. She read about the back 40 acres he had nearly sold without telling his dying father. The listing she had found. She read why she had done what she did. Not to punish him, but to save the ground from one bad year and one proud man who loved it too much to see clearly. My father's face changed as she read. The red drained out, and what replaced it was something grayer and older and harder to look at. I was watching a man learn that the thing he had built his whole pride on had not been a theft. It had been a protection. A kindness he had never been told about, made by the person who loved him most, because she hadn't trusted him with it. My grandmother set down the letter. You always said this farm goes to the one who stayed, she said. She did not look at Dean. She looked at me. Stays with me, Gerald. It always has. And the one who stayed all these years was the girl who stayed by my side. Not the field. Her. My father sat down. He looked at his hands like they belonged to a stranger. He tried the line one more time, because a cornered man reaches for the old knife even after the blade is gone. She stopped being a Hayes, he said, the day she drove off this land. But it had nothing left in it. He said it to a table that had just watched the proof of how wrong he'd been, and it landed like a name called into an empty room. I didn't raise my voice to answer it. You keep saying that, I told him. But Grandma just put the Hayes name in my hands tonight in front of all of you. Not because I stayed on the dirt. Because I never once stopped showing up for her. That's what a Hayes is, Dad. It was never the ground. It was who you kept driving back for. My grandmother nodded. Then she said the thing that made it permanent. I had my lawyer file the amendment last week, she said. It's signed and witnessed, sitting in his office in town. I've named Nora my successor trustee. When I'm gone, she'll hold this land in trust for all of us. Not to own it. To make sure no one ever loses it over one bad year or one hidden debt. That's a job. I'm giving it to the one person here who knows how to read. In the silence after that, a chair moved. My mother stood up. Diane Hayes, who had kept the peace for 40 years by keeping quiet, who had traded her own voice for a version of calm that was really just a room no one was allowed to speak freely in. She pushed back her chair and walked the full length of that table. Past my father. Past Dean. Past every watching face. She came and stood beside me and put her arm around my shoulders. She didn't make a speech. She had spent all her speeches on silence over the years. But she stood there in front of every person in that room, and she chose a side out loud with her whole body. It was the loudest thing she had ever done. My grandmother wasn't finished. She turned to Dean, who hadn't moved from the sideboard, his hand still resting on the folder he'd never gotten to open. I know about the balloon payment, she said. Her voice stayed even. You've been trying to get me to sign that refinance for 2 months. The answer was always going to be no. Not because I want you to lose this place, but because that paper would have pledged everyone's home to cover one man's debt, and it would have been signed by an old woman in a room full of people she couldn't say no to. She let that sit. But I am the trustee. So Monday, you and I and a real advisor will sit down, and we will find an honest way through this. In the open where I can see it. Dean's hand came off the folder. He sat down hard in the nearest chair and put his face in his hands, and I think it was the first honest breath he had taken in months. The folder stayed shut. No one signed a thing. 22 people had come to watch my father give away a farm, And instead they had watched an 82-year-old woman quietly collect a truth she had been carrying since I was 9 years old. Brandy gathered the kids and left before dessert. My father stayed in his chair a long time, looking at nothing. My grandmother folded the papers back into the soft yellow envelope, tucked it into her purse, and clicked the brass clasp shut. The same small dry sound that had turned the whole room. "Well," she said, reaching for her water glass like it was any Sunday. "Now everyone knows whose it is." She kept her word on Monday. She sat down with Dean and a financial advisor and they restructured the debt the honest way. Equipment pledged, grain contracts signed over, no land touched. It wasn't painless. But no one got cornered into a signature. And the ground stayed in the trust where it belonged. Dean didn't lose the farm. He just lost the version of the future where he got it by hiding the paperwork. My father never said he was sorry. I stopped needing him to. But in June he called me, gruff and brief, and asked if I'd come read over a lease agreement a neighbor wanted him to sign, because he didn't trust his own eyes on it. It was the closest thing to peace he had in him. I took it. I'd been reading documents for strangers my whole career. I could surely read one for the man who taught me to walk. My grandmother is still with us. Still 4 minutes ahead of everybody. I'm the successor trustee now, which mostly means I drive her to cardiology and keep the record straight and make sure that whatever comes, no one ever loses that ground over one hidden debt again. I set one boundary after Easter and I have kept it. I will hold that land in trust for all of them, the way she asked. I'll do the unglamorous work. The taxes, the filings, the keeping straight. But I will never again sit at a folding table, while people who never read the paperwork decide out loud that I don't get a say. I'm the one who reads the file now. And I do it in the open. Last week I was out at the farm and Grandma Edith was resting. So I rubbed the lemon oil into that old oak table myself, working it into the grain the way she had done my whole life. Then I went to the front hall, opened the clock case and wound it with the brass key. Slow the way she does. It still runs 4 minutes fast. I left it that way, because she taught me that loyalty was never about who stayed on the land. It was about who kept showing up for the people standing on it, long after they'd written you off. Long after the table had been set without you. Long after the door had been shut in your face on the porch where you learned to walk. The deed doesn't care about any of that. It only knows whose name was recorded. And so do I.